weekend here. So we're looking forward to that. Wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We have an exciting guest here on our usual Friday live stream. But before I introduce our guest, I want to first talk about just give a little bit of logistical stuff out of the way here. First of all, we do these live streams every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time in the United States. So whatever time it is right now, take away about 15 minutes because we got a late start here today with some technical issues, but that's the normal time we do these live streams. These interviews also get repurposed for our Transformation Ground Control podcast, which comes out every Wednesday. So we do these interviews in front of a live audience just to get your involvement and get your questions and comments and that sort of thing. So if you're watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, or here on Crowdcast where we're broadcasting from, I encourage you to drop in any questions you have along the way as we're getting going here. So the other thing too, before I introduce our guest, if you could please just drop in the chat where you're from today, where you listen in from, what city or country are you in? Love to get a feel for where our global audience is joining us from here today. So I want to just give a real quick background here on our guest and someone you may recognize if you watch these live streams or if you watch the podcast or listen to the podcast every week. Just a few weeks ago, we had Brad Feakes on the show. And in that discussion, we talked about a number of different things. But after that discussion, he came back with an idea of, hey, why don't we talk about culture and how the kind of culture that better enables a more successful transformation and ERP implementation, and talk about, why that's different. If someone has a strong culture or a culture that's more aligned with the successful implementation versus an organization that doesn't, how are those things different, and how can a company recognize whether or not they have the right culture to enable it? So I thought it was a great idea. It's a good intersection of some of Brad's technical knowledge as well as the softer human side as well. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to have this great discussion here about how to create a culture of digital transformation, a culture of change, a culture of ERP, whatever you want to call it. So rather than me trying to explain the thought, we'll just jump right into the discussion and introduce Brad. Brad, thanks for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Eric. It's great to be talking with you again and to be talking on a very different subject. Kind of fun to take one kind of technical end of the spectrum and then move, radically to the other side, to the more softer people-based spectrum, because all are both equally important.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. And it's interesting because when you were on a few weeks ago, we talked about hosting and managed services in the cloud and some pretty technical stuff. And so you're the first guest that we've ever had here that's done a total 180 on the topics, that we cover. First of all, you're one of the few repeat guests, but of the repeat guests we've had, none have done a 180 quite like this one. So I appreciate you coming back to do this. This is a great topic.
Oh, good. Try to get the other side of my brain work and hope that it doesn't all melt down in the process. So.
Right. So it's a lot to think about for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess before we jump into the topic at hand, maybe for those that didn't see you the other week on this live stream or on our podcast, maybe give us a little bit of background, who you are and what Estes Group does and what your role is at Estes Group.
Sure. So Brad Feakes, I've been working with the Estes Group now for about 8 years. I come from the customer field, so worked with a company for 20 some years. Working my way up through the company. And at some point we started implementing an ERP system, and I got looped into that initiative. As that initiative closed off over several years, I found myself without a direction, and I ended up finding the Estes Group as my landing ground there for the next phase of my career. At the Estes Group, we do a lot of ERP-based work, both on the consulting side in terms of the implementation, configuration of applications, but also in providing the supporting services that make an ERP successful in terms of the standing up of the application in the cloud, the management of those components, and then even some of the peripheral services that you might need to support your overall ecosystem. So that's kind of us in a nutshell.
Great. Well, good. Well, it's good to have you back. And what kind of set up this whole topic and this whole interview that we wanted to cover here today was a comment you had made. We'd exchanged a couple of emails after you were on the last time, and you were talking about how you had a couple clients that were very similar on the surface. They were remarkably similar. They looked, on paper, they looked not quite identical, but about as close as you could get. And you were making the comment that even though they looked the same on the surface, they had very different outcomes, and there was something underlying all that that led to those very different outcomes. And so that sort of led us down this rabbit hole of talking about
Mhm.
culture. Very important rabbit hole, by the way. I don't want to be dismissive
Sure.
of the topic. So maybe to start, tell us a little bit about just at a high level. Tell us about these two organizations that you worked with recently that looked similar, and then we'll get into how are they different.
Sure, sure. And so, yeah, company specificity is one of those interesting elements of an ERP project that rarely gets, I think, enough daylight. Just because it's very easy to focus on the generalizable aspects of a company, and those kind of family characteristics of a given company sometimes don't always find their way to the fore, even though they can have a great impact on an overall implementation. So I had these two companies. They were very similar, as you noted. They were both they went live in a similar time frame, so general market conditions were very similar. They were both private owned, family based businesses. They were headquartered in the same state. They were of a similar size in terms of sales revenue. They both worked in roughly analogous market environments, providing products of, I would say, similar complexity. They were both coming from very old systems. They both were trying to replace legacy 40-year-old systems. These were systems that had found their favor in the 1980s, and they were trying to both pull away from them. And in terms of because of their size, they both had very similar and substantial project budgets and core team contributions. So all those pieces that made for a project were in play for these two initiatives. And they were also, I would say, they had the same system integrator as their partner. So they were using a similar methodology, similar family of consultants that came from a similar background. So a lot of those things were the same, and yet the experience of these two companies were so diverse.
Hmm.
One company was what I would consider kind of my golden child, my the one you put on a pedestal in terms of all the right things happened in all the right ways. Super complex project with layers of customization and third-party integrations and data conversion, all the challenges that normally faced an organization. But they had taken all of those and successfully gone live on time, on budget. Cutover was a big challenge, but it was a challenge that they very quickly got over. And pretty soon they got to be an independent company running on, and I would give them a weekly or a bi-weekly check-in, and they would give me the hand wave and say, "Hey, we're good. Thanks for your help." Um, on the other side, very similar situation, except for the cutover. The cutover was much rockier, much more challenging. The company's use of the system was much less optimal. Their challenges that they received in terms of processing orders, taking orders, managing inventory, started to affect the bottom line, started to affect shipments, definitely affected morale. It was a really rocky implementation that at that point, from the time they went live, we spent a fair bit of time trying to stabilize and bring them up to a level playing field, just so they could keep conducting their business. And so for me, having seen those two vastly different outcomes come from very similar general situations, I started researching and trying to understand just what it was that made these two situations so different. And I started revisiting, I would say, some of my own background in ERP change management, going back to my Six Sigma and Lean Six Sigma days to see if there were nuggets to be picked about what might be the cause of this different outcome. And for me, that's where I got to this idea of an ERP culture and started thinking about, oh, well, what are the cultural aspects that we might need to take more stock of when you're in the midst of an implementation, and probably especially at the front end of an implementation, understanding this is the cultural environment that I'm stepping into, and these cultural factors will impact likely where we find ourselves in a year or 2 year when we flip the switch.
Hmm. Interesting. So you may have already said this. I apologize if I missed it, but were both companies implementing the same technology? Would the technology itself had anything to do with it?
Yeah, they were implementing the exact same technology, same version.
Okay.
All of those things were apples to apples.
Okay. So you can eliminate that. That it wasn't like you're talking about SAP versus NetSuite or something. You're talking about
Mhm.
two companies implementing the same solution, similar size. You mentioned they're family owned,
Mhm.
similar industries, but one goes live on time, on budget. The other one doesn't, and the other one, I think you were starting to allude the fact that the implementation itself was rocky, and the use or the value that they got out of the system wasn't what
Mhm.
what the other company experienced.
Right.
Is that sort of a fair summary?
It really is. It's you best assess a system's success after cutover, and it's kind of those not even intangible. They're very measurable. How good accurate does your inventory stay? How does
Mm.
your shipment and delivery, your productivity and efficiency? All those metrics are things that can very easily be impacted adversely or uh, positively by a ERP system, and we saw those where one company kind of stayed nice and level and took the bumps and very quickly were back to their metrics. This other company had those challenges where those metrics all took a bit of a nosedive, and that led to the stabilization efforts to try to bring them back.
Okay, interesting. So what is it then? I know we may have given a bit of a spoiler at the beginning of this discussion, but maybe for those that are jumping in right now who don't know where we're going with this conversation, how would you summarize? What was the core fundamental difference between those two
Mhm.
companies? It's not the
Right.
technology, it's not different industry, not different size, it's not. They're both family owned, so you sort of take out all these variables that oftentimes lead to different outcomes. But what was it in your opinion?
Mhm. So, having spent a fair bit of time researching and trying to understand the pieces of how that might have gone awry with this one customer, I really think that the biggest impact are what I would call cultural factors. I started trying to get my head around what does it mean to have an ERP culture, and how does a company with an ERP culture or the lack of it, how does that affect their implementation? So I started to try to boil down in my mind what are the cultural characteristics of a company that could lead it to be successful or unsuccessful in an ERP implementation. And it's prefaced that to say it may not even be that these are necessarily good or bad cultural attributes across the board, right? Something that might make you good at ERP might be an inhibitor if you're trying to do something else. And different initiatives have different flavors to them that certainly overlap, but at the same time may not have just complete synergy amongst them. So a company might drive to do have a certain culture, and that might work very well for them given their market, their product, the size of their company. But when they step now into an ERP and they say, "I want all of those things, but I also want this whole endeavor managed by a systemic ERP system," well, suddenly that brings up a lot of potential pitfalls that may not have surfaced prior to that.
Hmm. Right. So, okay. So when you talk about this culture of ERP and the differences that you see in a client that was successful and another one that wasn't, how would you unpack this whole concept of culture? I mean, what are, if you had to do sort of that flyover and then we can kind of come
Mhm.
back and drill into them,
Sure.
what are some of the dimensions or variables that you see within that whole concept of culture of transformation, culture of ERP, whatever you want to call it?
Sure. Well, let me give you kind of the bullet points. And I always go back to second semester business class, taking notes furiously, and I always hope that my professor would give me the bullet points before. So I thought of six or seven kind of key aspects or characteristics that I found that successful ERP companies had that would be critical in being successful. One would be what I call clarity of focus. Constantly, what you say, separating the wheat from the chaff. A second one I would call attention to detail. That is attending to what William Blake called the minute particulars. Third factor or characteristic was preparation, the ability to value a plan and its execution. And another factor that I thought of was what I'd call empowerment. Now, empowerment's one of those vague kind of 1960s hippie terms. And when you say it to a manager in a manufacturing environment, their eyes normally roll back and they're like, oh boy, you're going to give me one of those mandatory diversity seminar greetings. But
Right.
I think there's really a tangible sense of empowerment that we can get into. Proactivity is another factor that I found is very helpful, that people and the culture naturally has the ability to jump ahead and surface things before things fester. Another factor was what I called sense of ownership, and that is the case where individuals within a company are willing to take on and own elements of an implementation. And my final one, and I think this is probably a general one that applies in a lot of areas, is cross functionality. the desire to understand a business process from the front to back, and not only to look at your own section, your own piece of the map, but understand how all those pieces are fitting together. Organization, I found those are some dimensions that, if you could understand those dimensions and how a company performs in those dimensions, you could have a better understanding going into a project to say, okay, this is a company that has a good basis or foundation to be successful with the activities of a project, versus one that might have some gaps and might have a need for a different approach or some different emphases.
Interesting. Well, that's a doozy of stuff there. That's quite the list. I feel like we could spend an hour, full interview on any one of these things. So maybe I'll come back to a few of them. And by the way, as I'm jumping into these different factors here, those of you watching the live stream on Crowdcast, YouTube, Twitter, or LinkedIn, please jump in, add questions, comments along the way, because this is super cool stuff. And I'd love to get your feedback or your questions as a follow-up here. But before we turn to the audience and get their questions, maybe let's come back to this whole clarity of focus. What do you, I think I know what you mean by that, but maybe explain that a little bit. Maybe there's some nuances here that we should be aware of that we're not always aware of when you think about clarity.
When I think about clarity of focus, I'm thinking about how a company separates key initiatives from tertiary initiatives and say, these are the things that are really going to move the dial for our company in our markets and based on our strategy. And they're good at really defining what those key ones are and focusing on them, and separating that from ancillary initiatives and that become distractions. In an ERP case, especially say if you're in a configure to order environment, being able to hold your product stable long enough to be able to build your configuration platform around that so that you don't have a moving target is one example. A configured order company that's constantly shifting its product, it's going to be very hard to implement an ERP system around a moving target. So that's where, when I talk about clarity of focus, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing companies that say, when it comes to the ERP project, this is number one. Everything else needs to be subservient to that. If you're spending time on other initiatives and they need you for ERP, you need to shift your attention to supporting this project.
So in the case of the two case studies you gave at the beginning of the discussion, the company that struggled with the go live and with the post go live, maybe help us explain how they didn't accomplish that clarity focus.
Sure. I think there was probably on that side a greater tendency to see multiple initiatives in parallel. This one company in question had some web-enabled customer-facing systems that they were trying to reinvent and redefine at the same time that they were implementing the ERP. And while that certainly was an important thing, of course, it's customer-facing, it did suck some of the oxygen out of the room, and it distracted certain individuals who were now trying to kind of multi-thread. And if those are some of your key members of the team, that really can create some challenges.
Yeah. And that's a good sort of risk red flag for a lot of organizations to watch out for, especially with all the change happening in the world and within organizations. You really have to think about, are we dedicating the right focus to this project? And are we moving at the right pace to account for the fact that, we do or don't have the right level of clarity focus there? I think a lot of organizations try to get too aggressive. They've got a million other priorities, and then they want to throw in an ERP or digital transformation on top of it, but they just don't have the resources to make all those projects successful. So at some point you have to figure out, okay, what are my real priorities here, and where am I going to focus those resources and maybe cut back in other areas?
Completely. It really is figuring out what are those things that could wait and what are those things that are truly time sensitive. And with ERP, you cannot do it halfway. You have to really put that investment to it to make that foundation. And if you want that foundation, that has to take that amount of effort.
Right. Now, what about attention to detail? Yeah, we all have heard that term in a lot of different settings, but when you're talking about digital transformation or ERP project, what are some examples, or what do you mean by attention to detail?
Right. So this one's really critical when it gets applied to an ERP environment. I see kind of two different threads of companies. I see companies that have made their way by being really independent, free thinking, quick thinking. I call these cowboy companies. They play it fast and loose. They shoot from the hip. Quite often they shoot first and hopefully they're accurate. And that's how they go to market. And customers sometimes like that because they are very reactive. They give the sense of being very customer focused. And those are all, of course, good things. At times, what's sacrificed by doing that is the attention to what happens internally to your organization in terms of your inventory levels, your manufacturing steps. You really are reliant on the rest of your organization having this really high level of tribal knowledge to cover for that kind of behavior. And as that tribal knowledge starts to atrophy, suddenly the gaps in the organization become more and more apparent. And I've seen this kind of culturally. I entered manufacturing, I think, in about 1999. And so the people who were in the organization when I first came, they've all retired. And with them, all that tribal knowledge is gone. Now, did that get passed off and disseminated to the next generation? I would say most many cases it doesn't, because I think we have a much more mobile society where folks slip in and out of companies much more readily than they did. This isn't the sort of case these days where you have 35-year veterans of one company. So that tribal knowledge is a much, much harder thing to sustain. And as a cowboy company starts losing those people, they find themselves more and more vulnerable. Now, within an ERP context, a cowboy company is going to have a hard time managing inventory, performing labor transactions, performing the transactions that are necessary in an ERP system to process it correctly. Oh, I shipped it to the customer. Did you ship it in the system? If you don't ship it, you can't invoice. If you can't invoice, now suddenly you don't have revenue. So you can see how the dominoes fall very quickly, that if you're not paying attention to those critical details, and there are maybe 5 or 6 critical details in the system: issuing material, shipping material, transferring material between bins, clocking in and out of labor. If you are bad at those few things, suddenly your ERP system is a mess. And if it's a mess, now suddenly you don't know the status of your product, you don't know the status of your goods, you don't know if you're going to have shortages to be able to actually produce goods to ship to your customers. The inattention to detail can suddenly undermine your entire system. And if you have implemented an ERP to replace what I call that tribal knowledge, that's where you could really find yourself in a challenge if that attention to detail is not there. If you're not letting the system help you uh, plan your business by giving it good data.
Yeah, it sounds so simple. Like it doesn't sound like you're saying anything crazy that some big gotcha or big aha moment. But on the other hand, do you think, well, then why did those two companies not? What was the difference with the company that didn't do that? Maybe could you give us some examples of how they didn't demonstrate that attention to detail, or was it as simple as they're just a gunslinging organization and that's the way they wanted to remain, or is there more to it than that?
Well, it's interesting. This is where methodologies start to attack one another, because when you're talking about lean and you say, oh, lean, we're eliminating waste, we're eliminating non-value added activity. Well, clocking in and out of this work order, that's non-value added. I shouldn't have to do that. Managing the location of this good. Well, there's no value in that. The customer doesn't care where it's located. I shouldn't have to do that. And you get it to a certain vicious cycle of that kind of mentality. And in a small organization where you can have visual management and simple things like that, maybe there's not the need for that level of ERP based administration. But if you get larger, you get to that point where you have what we used to call necessary non-value added, right? It doesn't add value because the customer doesn't pay for it, but it's necessary to be able to provide the things that the customer does pay for and the customer does value. So that was really, I think, where the two organizations ran into some of those challenges, is that one very clearly understood the value of inventory locations and a place for everything in its place. The other did not. And so inventory levels, varied widely between the two companies. So the ability to transfer inventory, locate it correctly, put it from the work centers into finished goods and vice versa. One company had that ability much more readily than the other.
Interesting. Yeah, you just by the way, you just gave me a great idea for a blog and or YouTube video, which is a clash of methodologies, because I love that concept, because they do. Those aren't your exact words, but you're saying they attack each other, and I agree. You have to. It's hard sometimes because you get conflicting frameworks and opinions on how things should look, and you as an organization have to figure out how to balance that in a way that fits. But yeah, that attention to detail and the just the discipline. It's really more than just attention to detail. It's also discipline and prioritization of knowing where to focus your time and effort. And the tribal knowledge piece is really important too. I think that's a great point you make about you lose a lot of that over time as you leave, or as people leave the organization. What about preparation? What are some components of preparation that you saw in these two particular cases that we're
Mhm.
contrasting? Maybe compare it back to those two companies you were
Right.
talking about.
So again, this probably goes back at this level as more of kind of the project management of the two projects internally, right? So any ERP project has an external element of project managers, which the system integrator and or a third-party project management company are working to kind of administrate and orchestrate all the steps. Internally to the project, you have your internal project management resources who are helping organize the project team, serve as an interface to the steering committee, and work to marshal resources as needed. um, between those two projects, I think there was a much better skill at standard project management methodologies and the kinds of activities that would come to say, okay, if I'm going to be successful at this project, I need to look ahead and say, these are the things that I need to prepare. These are the pieces I need to set into place. Some of that might have to do with the staffing of the internal department, not just for the core team, but also the IT department that's kind of supporting and playing that peripheral role. And we all say that ERP is a business activity, not an IT activity. And that's, of course, one of the great pitfalls. But at the same time, a well-supported IT department can do great wonders to help a project forward without necessarily taking over that ownership. So I think that inside of that, there was a great understanding for the need for preparing the company and the team through all these phases. And it had to do with the kind of internal knowledge of the company itself and how to drive certain things forward, things that a system integrator is just going to be blind to.
Yeah, yeah, super interesting. Now, in that case, and I might ask you this again as it relates to some of the things we're still yet to get to, but on these things we've talked about so far, preparation, attention to detail, clarity of focus, are these things that are just inherently baked into an organization or not? Or is it a muscle that organizations can develop or should be developing either during or even before
Mhm.
they start their transformation or their implementation?
Boy, this is a great question, and in my mind, I tend to think that these are things that existed quite often prior to an ERP project and should exist well after it. And there's often quite a bit of overlap to other areas and other areas of focus. And let me talk about the next one, which is empowerment, because
Yeah.
that one for me is a really good example of this right thing. So we were talking just before about how lean and ERP sometimes butt heads. Other times they're immensely consonant with one another. I was working with one company and they were doing a value stream mapping activity at the front end of a ERP implementation. And they were using this as an opportunity, not just to define the process maps that we would try to use for the ERP project, which is a great thing to do, but they were also using it as an opportunity to surface existing opportunities for improvement inside of the organization, what they sometimes call low hanging fruit, and start the process of getting people to put in feedback as to say, this is how our current process is working, and this is how we think we could do it better. And the manufacturing manager at the time, he said, an ERP, a lean implementation, which is what he called it, it's a bottom up approach. We are looking for your investment and your ideas on how to define processes and make them better. And I was thinking to myself and saying, wow, that's exactly what you do with a core team in an ERP implementation. You are looking for them to define the processes and configure the system and take that ownership and be empowered to define how the system and how the company is going to process in the future. So we've talked about how lean and ERP can work against each other. In this other very critical way, they can be along the same lines, and it's that idea of empowered workers being able to define their processes. And for this, I like the what I call an operational definition of empowerment. So I talk about empowerment as the tendency to clearly define an individual's area of responsibility, making them accountable for clear outcomes in those areas, but then providing them the resources and the autonomy to achieve those outcomes. So in my mind, resources and autonomy are really what comes down to empowerment. It says, I'm not going to override you, even though you're my direct report. I'm going to give you responsibility in this area. I'm going to give you the autonomy to make decisions, and I'm going to hold you accountable to drive change. And that for me was kind of the heart of lean, and it's the heart of a good ERP implementation. Because if you have a bunch of disempowered people who come in as your core team member, it's like going to war with an army of chronically depressed lemmings. It's just not going to work, right? You need people who are empowered and ready to fight the battles and take ownership and get over that hill to help bring this thing bring this thing in successfully. So that was a piece there where I think from an organizational standpoint, those are characteristics that should apply in every successful organization. And then those are the types of people, if you're talking about, because I think as we get further along, we're going to talk a lot about people more than process here. Those are the people you try to bring into an ERP project.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And you talked about methodologies attacking each other. And as you were just describing empowerment, I started thinking about some potential conflicts with the other things you just talked about. So when you think about clarity of focus, for example, and let's just say our clarity of focus is that maybe we need to be a little bit more top down, or we need to have more of an overarching global strategy or common operating model that might take away some of that localization, which would then potentially be perceived as taking away empowerment or running counter to this concept of empowerment. And I think you started to touch on this a little bit, but how do you balance that top down need with the bottom up need? Because you do need empowerment, but you also need clear vision, clarity of focus, that sort of thing. So
yeah, so
what have you seen there?
it seems like what I found is successful is that managers are good at defining the box and saying, okay, this is the box. Within this box, I'm going to give you free reign. If you need to get out of that box, well, then we need to work together and do some collaborative stuff. And that's when the cross functionality becomes helpful. When I see a culture that is maladaptive, I often see a lot of people who are very hesitant, and then you have a couple of alpha dogs running amongst them who are just kind of making decisions across departments and overpowering people in this area or that. And that's, I think, in my mind, the idea of a box is that you say, okay, within this box, manager, make this happen. And the ability to define those boxes, I think, is where some of the critical management skill comes in.
Right. Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. You kind of setting some guardrails from the top down, but then within those guardrails, that's where the empowerment kicks in. And if you need to go outside the guardrails, that's where you have to reconcile and figure out, what the right path forward is. So that's really good point. And by the way, I just have to mention this. You may be the only guest that every time I interview you drop at least one word that I have to go look up after the interview.
Oh,
in this case, it's maladaptive. I'm like, I have no idea what that word means. I got the context of what you're saying, but I need to go look that up when we're done here. So I have young sons who are both studying vocabulary right now. So I'm constantly trying to brush up my vocabulary as well.
Good. My once a day. So once you know the meaning of the world, we'll be good.
Right. Exactly. So, okay. Another one you had on your list here was proactivity. Tell us about that. What is it? Maybe explain it a little bit, and then talk about how the two companies contrasted against one another.
I think with proactivity, and probably you could say this overlaps with some of the other areas, but a proactive company is one that's looking ahead to understand kind of the chess game 3 moves out. And they're using that as motivation to get this current step done successfully. It says, I know where I need to be before this CRP or conference room pilot event occurs. So I'm going to do my cross-functional testing really thoroughly so that I know when I get there, I will be ready. Proactivity also comes with what I would call the willingness to surface bad situations or poor performance early. So if you are in a management meeting, one of it's very easy in a management meeting to try to get through your updates without surfacing any of the problems, because problems create conflict creates more meetings, and you try to get those you try to shuffle through those. A proactive company, I think, knows when the time is right to say, we need to talk through this because this is underperforming. And if this happens continually throughout the project, we're going to get to a bad spot when this is done. So it's that willingness to kind of surface problematic issues and have difficult conversations early that I think separate companies that are successful from unsuccessful. Because I think going back to my chronically depressed lemming metaphor, when there were times when we needed with one company, we needed honest feedback about how team members felt we were doing and how ready we were. That feedback was the kind of feedback you heard 3 months later in a whisper. I didn't need that in a whisper. We needed that, 5 months ago before we, started pushing forwards. So that honest feedback, and that is, in my mind, one of the proactive traits of a successful organization.
Yeah, really well put. I agree with that. And you're also you're sort of hitting on a whole nother can of worms, a whole nother cultural dimension, which is just that candor, the ability to communicate openly and realistically and honestly within an organization. And it's amazing how many organizations get bogged down by their own internal politics or fear, micromanagement, things that would undermine that ability to have those sort of candid conversations right then when you need to be having them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Super, super interesting. Okay. And then what about, you had also mentioned sense of ownership. Is that like empowerment? Or is that different? Is this a different concept?
Well, I would say empowerment is kind of the top-down. Sense of ownership might be thought of as the bottom up. When I think about some of my best individual core team members, they were the ones who were just excited to take on this area of their project and represent their area and do whatever they needed to do to make sure that area implemented correctly. And because of that, they had that sense of ownership that when they would work through the configuration of a system and the definition of business processes, let's assume it's a sales area, the movement of quotations to sales orders, and then the final processing of sales orders before they became work orders. So before you handed them over to manufacturing, to know that, okay, I have to deal with the outputs of manufacturing. I get the inputs of outside sales, and inside of that I have all these challenges in defining that process. I'm going to take those on. I'm going to find out what those challenges are. I'm going to be setting up meetings. I'm going to be pulling in resources. I'm going to be asking questions. That sense of ownership that a successful company has is so much stronger than an unsuccessful. I say, if a consultant ever feels like they're pulling teeth when they do their job, when they ever feel like they are pulling their customer along, kicking and screaming, you're probably running into a sense of ownership problem where that the appropriate ownership is not being presented by your core team members. And quite often that is a function of empowerment, right? A disempowering environment that's constantly kind of pulling the rug out from underneath people is not going to foster a sense of ownership. Now, I use the Cool Hand Luke metaphor. I don't know if you've seen the movie Cool Hand Luke. I love Paul Newman, whether it's salad dressing or, all right, perfect. Whether it's salad dressing or otherwise, I like Paul Newman. But there's this great scene in Cool Hand Luke where they wanted to break him and they have him dig that pit. And as soon as he finishes digging the pit, they have him fill it back in. And as soon as he finishes filling that back in, they have him dig it out again. And they keep having him do this repetitive, monotonous, fruitless task until he finally breaks down. And I've been told that organizations are kind of like that. When you are constantly undermining your employees by pulling the rug out from underneath them, you get to this situation where you slowly create a bunch of Cool Hand Lukes and you kind of break them. And when you do that, you take away that sense of ownership away from them. So when you have a company that hasn't done that, you get these folks who are just ready to take things on because you can tell that they know that no one's going to be pulling the rug out from underneath them. Someone's going to be letting them take this over the finish line, and as a result, the sense of ownership is amazing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess before we get to your unpack your last bucket as it relates to culture, I have to ask this question just because it ties to the last two things you talked about, and that is. Two things you talked about was this concept of ownership. And then we were also talking about that sort of candid, honest, open conversations internally and decisions that need to be made. So I guess I'll ask you this as being a part of the system integrator implementation partner of our community. Estes Group is a VAR that helps companies implement different types of ERP systems on the technical and functional side. So when an SI or a VAR like yourselves come in, sometimes, honestly, having worked with Estes enough, I know this does not apply to you, but a lot of your peers, this does apply to, which is you come in and you tell the customer what they want to hear. And there's a lack of ownership that kind of comes along with that because now I'm buying into this whole sales message that I'm getting from my implementation partner. So now suddenly I've sort of deferred ownership to my partner and they're the experts. So I'm going to let them do all the work and I'm sort of ceding ownership. And then there's also the honesty part of it where, a lot of vendors, quite frankly, in the market tell lies to, they share lies with their customers to try to close a deal. They may not think they're lying. They're using the typical sales and marketing spin that, gets people to buy their software, buy their services. So how do you balance that? Like if you're working with a partner that might be, even if it's unintentionally, introducing those dynamics into the equation, what advice would you have for a customer that, you're also saying, hey, you've got to have this honest and open communication. You need to, be empowered. You need to have the ownership, all that stuff. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, those are great questions, and they are real legitimate challenges. When you're at the front end of a project, you're making some estimates based on a lot of assumptions, and quite often you don't know necessarily how much your customer will take on various parts of a project, and the amount that a customer is willing to take on more, that sense of ownership again, the more that a customer takes on, the less a integrator has to do. And in terms of budget, that's one way of obviously keeping the budget in line. Now, as a system integrator, I would hope that if I'm laying out a estimate of how long this takes, it would be with those baked in assumptions saying, hey, we're expecting that you're going to provide 6 people, at least 50% utilized on the project, that you're not going to be pulling them away, yet, et cetera. You lay out, this is within this context, we think it should take this much effort. On the customer side, if I was speaking to a customer, how do you vet an integrator who's making a proposal and not over promising and under delivering? You would be trying to surface those assumptions, saying, okay, is this what you believe to be the full project? What are the things that could drive this project over? Have you accounted for these areas of the business? The best customers I've had have been very critical of our own offerings and saying, are you sure you're putting enough time and effort into this specific area, because we think this area might be a problem? And so then we have that conversation to say, okay, well, maybe we need, as an integrator, to talk a little bit more about your business requirements there before we come up, with a high level estimate that can lead you down there. So definitely the idea of candor before the paperwork is signed is really critical, and
Yeah.
understanding these were our assumptions, because if you have a shared assumption going into a project, that's about the best thing you can do, because you have line of sight to what you thought you could do and what you couldn't, and now you can start measuring against that immediately and saying, okay, this stage of the project, right out of the gate, we thought we could do this, we've actually done that. Are we tracking? Do we need to make adjustments? You want to make those adjustments as early as possible, so that there are fewer surprises as possible later in the game.
Yeah, yeah, and it's sort of like, as you're talking through all this stuff, it makes me think that, if you're an organization that's about to go through a transformation, you've got all these outside forces, that could influence the way you operate or the way your transformation goes. You've got different software and technology options. You've got different system integrators and different outside third parties that might be helping you through the transformation. You've got different methodologies and frameworks and skill sets you could be drawing from. And a lot of times those are in conflict, and it's not a clean puzzle to put together. But at the end of the day, it is your puzzle to put together, and you kind of have to figure out do I have the right system integrator? Are they telling me the truth? Do I feel like they're telling me the truth? Are they being a good partner? Are they enabling me to be empowered and to own this project and all the stuff you just talked about? So I think that's if I were to summarize a bottom line nugget to take away, is that everything you're saying leads me to think that, you need to have that level of ownership and just know that it's your project. It's not the system integrators. It's not the technology vendors. It's not a methodology issue, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Really, you do. I mean, you want, of course, a system integrator who has a lot of skin in the game. And I think it's too easy sometimes for folks to make promises and then hope that they get transferred to the next project before anything starts hitting the fan. But at the same time, as a customer, you got to understand that I'm owning this system, and when the system integrator is gone, I'm still going to have this system. I'm going to be
Right.
responsible for its ongoing maintenance and configuration, and that basic understanding needs to be there from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. You're the one that has to live with it. That's a good point. And thanks for amusing me or going with me down that rabbit hole. But I thought that was an important one maybe to touch on, given
Yeah,
everything
for
you've talked
sure.
about so far. So the last bucket you had mentioned earlier was cross functionality as sort of the cultural dimension that you see as a big difference between successful
Mhm.
transformations and the ones that aren't. What do you mean by that?
Well, for me, cross functionality or team member. It's a great attribute of people in general in terms of your end users. So I think it probably exists most at that level. I had on one of my projects, which was one of the successful ones, I had one of my standout team members when we kind of went around the room and say, well, what are you trying to get out of this project personally? Do you have any personal goals for this project, et cetera? We kind of go through the room to talk to people and see where their minds are at. And he said, well, I've always been in this area since I entered the company. I really want to understand what the rest of the company looks like. I really understand, and I think this individual was in sales. I want to know how manufacturing works, and I understand how I affect manufacturing, or inventory. I want to understand how inventory is integrated with sales, or how sales affects the engineering process. And that's, in my mind, the great thing about cross functionality is that ability to get 3 or 4 steps outside of your own IPO diagram and understand what those outputs look like and what those inputs look like, because we're all someone's customer and we're all the supplier to someone else internally. And folks who are interested and willing to know that are much better at configuring the system. One, because they're taking those things into consideration. They're also doing themselves a favor, because ERP projects are, more than in anything, is for an individual team member, they're this great opportunity to learn the entire business. And a ERP team member who doesn't realize the value of that, I think, is really doing themselves a disservice. So if you have to see that value, I think that makes for a really positive outcome, because one, they're learning the system better. They don't need to be always relying on someone else to help them if they need to set up a test scenario. If you are a manufacturing person and you've gone and you've learned how to enter a sales order so that you can execute against that sales order, you don't need to be waiting on other people to do your work for you, because you've kind of extended yourself. That doesn't mean you're going to be a salesperson when the project's done, but it means that you've had that extra bit of leverage that you can now use going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it also contributes to accomplishing some of these other things you've already talked about. You know, the cross functionality mitigates that risk of tribal knowledge just walking out the door. You know, when you're cross functional, you're hedging against that risk, even if that's not your intent. It's also, a way to create ownership. So you've got this cross functional team that understands the entire operation. So you're inherently creating some sort of ownership across the organization. So I think that's a really good point. Um, what I want to do, we're actually getting some comments and questions here on, especially on LinkedIn, which always tends to be our most active engagement from audience members. So maybe I'll pick a couple questions and comments here, and then I've got some follow-ups for you as well.
For sure.
So just a few things. First of all, we have like I mentioned before, a global audience. We've got people from Spain, Norway, Jordan. Obviously, the United States is one. Where we're at, London in England. So we've got a good audience just as a sample. Those are some of the countries that people are listening in from today. But some of the comments here, this comment is from Lisa on LinkedIn. She says that this is a great list. You know, your list is a great list. These factors would be key to any transformational initiative. And it's a great point. I totally agree and was thinking that too. It's like, forget ERP for a minute. This is just about any sort of transformation, whether it's HCM, CRM, or just a business transformation of sorts. These are really good. These apply to any sort of massive change effort that a organization might go through. And then another comment here, this is from Liam on LinkedIn as well. And I'm just curious to see, maybe to come back to this whole concept of, I think you were talking about this when we were talking about clarity of focus, I believe. But Liam says cowboy companies have a cognitive dissonance and can't see why their behaviors are self-harming. So have you seen that, or did you see it in this example where, they've got this gunslinging cowboy mentality, but they think it's a good thing, and maybe it was a good thing and has been a good thing up until now, but now as you try to maybe add a little bit of structure, take away a couple of the guns that they're carrying around, do you see that they don't realize that there is a downside to that kind of culture?
I think for sure that kind of cowboy culture can undermine some things. Let me give you a couple of little examples. This one is actually coming from an earlier company of mine. The company touted its customer service, and this had to do with the delivery of replacement parts or what have you if they needed them out in the field. General manager got a call 6 o'clock at night. The factory's already closed. I need this part into the field. I need it in a hurry. He looks around in inventory in the stocks, nothing's there. He sees a part that's already been assembled on an existing piece of machinery, pulls out a wrench, pulls the material off the existing component, throws it in a box and sends it. Great customer service, except now in the morning, the shop is struggling to figure out, oh, suddenly I can't finish this piece of equipment. I'm late on this other shipment now. I've got to pull this equipment offline, put it into a queue, which is inefficient. Now it's sitting there collecting dust, getting banged around. So you can see that's kind of a tangible example of, I helped one customer, I hurted another, and I confused the living daylights out of my own staff. So that's kind of one, I think, cognitive dissonant example that might make a lot of sense to someone. Another would be kind of broadly speaking, the customer is always right tendency. We design products to meet customer needs. And in especially in engineer to order environments, I think that's a tendency that can take over a company where everything they do is a snowflake. And the inability to have repeatable processes is driven by that belief that our core competency is satisfying custom demands. I see more successful companies sort of pull back on the customization route to say, Mr. Customer, I know you wanted it that way. I can get 85% of what you need for a lot less money. Is that something you're willing to do? Most customers are willing to go there. So I see that's an area where standardization and taking, at least you keep the cowboy hat on, but you take off the Stetsons maybe, or the boots. Boots. Stetson is a hat. I suck at my cowboy metaphors are falling
I'm terrible at
entirely
metaphors
flat.
too. That's all right. I was with you though. I was following you though, even if it was
But
wrong.
Perfect. But so dialing back just a little bit of that, I think can have good gains for for the company and for their customers because you're giving them something else of value. In this case, it's a cost reduction. By standardizing, I can give you this product, but I don't have to spend all that, high dollar trying to fine tune it and custom engineer it for you. So that's a couple areas where I think some of that cowboy culture can be dialed back a bit.
Yeah, great point. And as you were talking about the first example, the example of someone pulling apart or a finished good for another customer who needs a rush, but then you're hurting the other customer. Um, a lot of organizations, especially in the mid market, I'd say, you see a lot of these heroics where the company has grown and been successful because they have these heroics. Like I'm doing what's best for this customer, and
Mhm.
if I'm the guy or gal that did that, I'm going to take a lot of pride in that. I'm sure I'm not thinking about the impact it had on another customer and the fact that I just messed up the order for another customer. But in my mind, I saved this. I made this customer happy, despite the fact that there's process limitations or system limitations, whatever. I was still able to do it. So now, when you start talking about taking that away and say, well, actually, we're not going to do quite so much gunslinging, we're going to have a more standard process
Mhm.
for how you prioritize orders or how you allocate orders to customers. Um, that may be good in theory for the business overall, and it probably is good for the business overall. But for me individually, like you're taking away my ability to be heroic, and that's what I take
Mhm.
pride in. So now you're really talking about taking away my pride. So I think that's where a lot of that unintended or that hidden resistance to change comes from, is because I'm not a bad person because I'm resisting the fact that now you want to standardize these processes. I really do want to help the customer. I take pride in that. So
Mhm.
how do have you seen that before, or how have you seen organizations sort of reconcile that or work through that
Mhm.
transition?
Yeah, I see that a lot, and it's going back to our bullet points. That individual, that firefighter. Everybody in America praises our firefighters, right? And no
Right.
one praises a fire preventer because you never see the problems that they avoided.
It's a great
But
point.
when you have someone who is a firefighter and has been raised in a culture of firefighting and praised for that, it is a real challenge to take that away from them. I think the key where I've seen success is in being able to find the new things that you replace that become the things that you take pride in, right? I take pride in consistency. I take pride in delivery. If your firefighting hit our on time shipment schedules, maybe you say, well, our on time shipment schedule took a hit for that firefighting. Let's focus ourselves on that as our core metric and try to drive that really positive sense of ownership and take that and try to rechannel it towards something that's a little more adaptive.
Right. Yeah. Very good stuff. So here's another comment and then a question from Sam Graham, who's a member of Third Stage's VIP Super Fan Club. He's on a lot of our live streams. So thanks for being here again, Sam. So his first comment is, "This is pure gold, chaps." So nice job. Kudos to you, Brad. This is good. This is really good stuff. I totally agree with Sam. I'll second that. And then he has a follow-up question here, which is it true that companies need to refocus when they change from being a large, small company to a small, large company
Mm.
while doing an ERP or digital transformation project? I love that question. I'm curious to hear what you think.
Well, that's a great one because I was working with one company that said that exact same thing to me. They say we need to go from being a big little company to being a little big company, and we need to understand what that means. And there is a lot of refocusing that needs to happen. I think I have a podcast or a presentation that I did that speaks about this very thing about when you get into a larger organization, more structure quite often is required in order to keep things from getting disorganized. And this even exists inside of your ERP system with things like your bill of materials structure. You can have a very loose bill of materials structure in a small company because, again, tribal knowledge, you know how all the pieces go together. As you need to ship more products and your product complexity increases, the bill of materials structure becomes kind of an important thing, because now you need to know where this component needs to get built, because you've had to add another building where they make sub-assemblies now, and your sub-assemblies are all occurring over there. So they can't just be a phantom bill of material that blows up into a parts list. You need a discrete assembly that's being made in that other area so that they're accountable, so that they have a plan that they can work against. So as you're moving into a different kind of organization, you really do need to tweak how you might implement your system. And it is I would say it's one of the biggest challenges, is to do a business scale transformation at the same time that you're doing an ERP transformation. I had a company once, they were venture capital owned, and they wanted to get to be this great big sellable thing really quickly. So they combined 3 facilities into one, implemented ERP, and then moved to a new facility at the same time. So it was the consolidation of kind of 3 core elements of the organization all at once. It was it was an interesting experience, and probably fodder for its own hour-long session. But you really do need to try to figure out what your target is when you jump into that ERP system configuration, because you can configure it around a small company, you can configure it around a big. If you're trying to do both at the same time as your company is transforming, it's kind of like trying to hit that moving target. You get that moving target scenario, is that what you configured on in June no longer applies in July.
Yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, that's a good point. So how about this? I know we're up on an hour here, and this is easily something we could spend a whole nother hour on, different dimensions of culture here. But if we have to sort of summarize or close the loop on all this, when we think about, I asked you earlier about the question about, are these cultural dimensions things that are baked into a company's DNA, or is it something that you can develop those muscles and change? So kind of along those lines, when you think about an organization's culture, I guess just to start, if I don't demonstrate those cultural strengths that you're saying are key to success and are going to enable a more successful project, but I also know that I need to change and I need to implement new technology or process changes, organizational changes. I need to go through some sort of transformation, but I don't have the right culture to support it. What do I do? Do I just not do anything? How do I prioritize?
Right.
How do I go down this path?
Right. We can't just sit around and do nothing. That's the obvious answer. But what can
Right.
we do? Let me give you a couple of anecdotes. Sometimes an anecdote explains this better than a ramble, or maybe an anecdote is a ramble, but don't mind me. So I had one company. They had been very kind of top down, command and control, and they wanted all at once to kind of become empowering. So a manager who had managed his people in kind of a dictatorial stance for a good 20 years suddenly said, guys, you're in charge. I'm going to leave you to design the factory. They were building a new factory at the time. You design the shop layouts. I'm going to give you full control. These were individuals, supervisor level, shop manager level type folks who had never been given that control before, never had developed those muscles, those skills of decision making and ownership and all these pieces kind of that we talked about. They struggled to come up with new ideas. So basically, they implemented the old factory footprint in the new one. They fell back on what they knew and they reinvented the past. So there's definitely a challenge of, it can't just be, oh, you're empowered, now go do it. There's got to be something that comes along with that. I go back to, so I came out of Six Sigma and Lean and was very process oriented for the early part of my career. My life, everything was a process flow. Then I read Good to Great. You've probably read that. And he took a very different approach. He didn't focus on process, he focused on people. And he said the people are where everything starts from. And trying to define good processes in the absence of good people is a real challenge. So I've seen companies do who are trying to make this challenge. Quite often it involves the addition of new people and finding the right people. It becomes the hiring activity. Someone told me, if you ever want to scale your business, you need to get into the HR profession. And it's that kind of ideas that you need to understand what makes a good resource and how they could fit into your organization. And then you start empowering those people. And the hope is that it becomes contagious. You put the right people in positions of control, and they similarly work to their direct reports and downstream of, okay, I'm going to start giving you more decision criteria. I'm going to start giving you clear objectives, and I'm going to start letting you kind of build those muscle sets to be able to do those things. I think, and this is, probably a good question for you, because you jump into a lot of organizations and assess them at the onset of an organization. Probably you're thinking the same thing when you start assessing the culture of a company about to dive into ERP. What do they need to do to try and get those things ready to be successful? And for me, probably it would start with candor again, is that we need a good, honest assessment of, this is where we think we are as a company. These are some of the areas where we need to start developing skills. And then you start having conversations between core team members and their old managers or what have you, to try to figure out, okay, are we working through this idea of, I'm going to be making decisions that affect your department? Are we good with that? Are you having a struggle there? And then we need to spend more time. I would say the long and the short of it is, it's good if you have people who are specialists at that form of change management, who can help mediate and guide that, because quite often an ERP consultant is not a psychologist and is not going to be great at managing those pieces. So quite often, if you run into a situation where change management and culture is a challenge, you're probably looking to try to bring in some people who can help kind of guide that whole enterprise forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very well put. And that is something that our many of our clients hire us for, is for that change management cultural piece of it. So last question I have for you then is, and I have a lot more I could ask, but I'll kind of cherry pick maybe a capstone sort of question. If I'm a team member or an employee within an organization, I'm not the CEO, I'm not executive sponsor, and I know that my organization does not demonstrate some of these cultural dimensions that you're saying is important to success. What do I do? How can I affect change within the organization? How can I help bend the culture? How can I influence the right people to ensure that we, are deliberately going into this to bend the culture however we need to?
Right, right. So that sounds like one of those, what to control the things that I do have control of and to know the difference sort of speeches. For me, it would be depending on kind of where you're at in the organization. I mean, I've talked with plenty of people who, in that situation, they start looking at the want ads to see if there's a better fit for them culturally. And I could understand why people are in that spot. For folks who are kind of in middle management, I've seen cases where folks do a really nice job of saying, well, I don't have control of what's happening up above me, but I do have control of my direct reports and the area to which I have control. I'm going to try to make sure that I'm fostering that kind of environment, and then trying to do my best to manage one level up. Because you can always try to manage up to that one level and keep that conversation going, and try to get your manager to be thinking, okay, well, yeah, maybe these are some things that are valuable, and things that we could, for one, establish a reasonable relationship that is sufficiently empowering, has the right amount of ownership, etc., but also might from there foster its way vertically across the organization. That would be the best case scenario that I think I would look for.
Yeah, it's almost like a sort of a ground game. You have to influence the right stakeholders, the right executives and sponsors, and educate and bring in outside perspectives like the ones we're talking about here, or even just sharing this video or this discussion with stakeholders within your project team and your organization can be a big help as well. So,
Sure,
well, this is good stuff. I really appreciate you being here, Brad. This is an awesome conversation. I love this topic, and it's a super cool marriage of technology and change, and tying it all together as sort of a glue, which is culture. And so it's a super cool topic. Really appreciate you being here today.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Love the opportunity, Eric. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks to the audience here for asking great questions. We had a really good turnout, especially in the United States, where it's the Friday afternoon before a holiday weekend. We had a great turnout. So I really appreciate everyone that joined here live, and appreciate it. And we'll repackage this interview. It's going to be edited and polished and baked into an overall episode of Transformation Ground Control, which will come out a week from Wednesday with this exact interview. So feel free to share this video, the raw video footage you're watching here, or certainly when you see the podcast here in a week from Wednesday, you can look at that and share that as well. So thank you everyone for joining today. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you hopefully next Friday. We do these live streams every Friday, 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern time, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again, Brad. Thanks, audience, and everyone else. We'll see you soon. Take care.